use her Sunday name. Mostly we just call her Fran. Now, I'm the Ombudsman. Fran is the INWO, the Independent National Whistleblowing Officer Teams manager. And you'd be thankful to hear that you're not going to hear an awful lot from me. I'm just going to do some introductions, set the scene, and then Fran will take over, and then we'll finish with the Q&A, but maybe a bit more about the detail of what we're covering. Also want to welcome and thank Stephen Lindsay and Martin McKay and everybody who has joined us today. Realise time is precious, so appreciate that. So do we want to just move on to the general welcome and introductions? But it might be helpful to just give a bit of background as to why we're running this particular webinar. Within the whistleblowing standards, which Fran is going to talk about more, there are a number of different roles, but what we have identified for ourselves is some of the most critical and value-adding roles are the ones that provide support to whistleblowers. And in the context of the whistleblowing standards, the role and support of trade union reps, I think is one of the most important. But there wasn't, from our understanding, a common understanding of what that might be. So we thought it might be helpful to just set out our understanding of what your roles will cover in an INWO whistleblowing context, but also to give you an opportunity to meet us so that you know who you're talking to if you contact us. So I don't know if you want to move on to the next one, Fran. So I'm going to hand over after this slide, but the things that we are going to cover are, more information about the standards and the INWO, how we came about. Now, the identification of whistleblowing issues, we've covered because it's slightly different to PIDA. The whistleblowing legislation in Scotland, and hence the standards, does go slightly wider than PIDA, and it's probably helpful for you to understand that. We're going to look at a scenario and cover about what to do when somebody seeks assistance, and then again have a scenario on that, and then really a general thing about getting the most out of the process. And hopefully there'll be time at the end for you to ask us questions. We'll try and answer them, and the ones we can't, in good presentational practice style, we'll make a note of and get back to you. But as I said, welcome. We're really pleased to see so many of you here, and I'm going to hand over to Fran and turn my microphone off. Thank you.
Many thanks, Rosemary. I just wanted to take this opportunity to say welcome. Thank you for coming. It's probably best if you could switch your cameras off just now, because there may be some of us who struggle with bandwidth, and it's obviously easier if there's less going on screens to manage. So if you can do that for us, that's very helpful. And keep your mics off until the Q&A afterwards. So we're recording this session so that we can put it on our website, and people can access it whenever they need to, for people that aren't able to be here today. And we'll switch off when it gets to the Q&A session. So it'll just be the presentation that's recorded, just so that you're aware of that. So what I wanted to cover initially was a quick run through of the standards to make sure everyone's up to speed with what they are and how they work a little bit. Some of you will be
sorry, Fran.
Hi.
Sorry to interrupt. I didn't know how to switch my camera off.
Oh, it should be at the very bottom. There's some, if you can switch, it's next to the mic. So if you manage to find the mic on and off, the camera switches
it's
right.
It's okay, Alison. I've managed to switch it off for you. You're fine.
All right, grand. Thank you. Because I said the video and I thought it was right. Okay, thank you. Now I can put my sound. Oh yes, I can. Right, okay.
So the standards apply to all NHS providers. So that's all boards, but it also covers any health service that's being provided by or on behalf of the NHS. So that's health services provided by HSCPs, primary care services, and all services that are contracted by the NHS. It also includes, in terms of the people covered by it, it should be accessible to all staff, students, trainees, and volunteers. So it goes a lot more broadly than previous whistleblowing initiatives did. And that's to make sure that it covers anyone who can be working within a health service setting, basically. The standards provide a clear definition of whistleblowing, which is really based on the risk of harm or wrongdoing in the public interest. So it's a really, the aim is to identify where there's risks and for people to feel able to raise concerns about those risks at the earliest opportunity. There's a two-stage process within the standards, with a third stage of review with the INWO, with ourselves. And some of the critical elements that I wanted to focus on to highlight in terms of the standards are that it encourages that an early resolution of concerns. So before it even gets into a formal process, there's reference to business as usual processes where people can raise concerns with their line manager or through existing routes, through team meetings or huddles, through one-to-ones, or existing formal routes like significant event procedures. So there is the option of raising things obviously informally, and it's not until it gets into the formal stages of the whistleblowing process that it becomes the process is set out within the standards. One of the focuses of the standards is to provide full confidentiality and protection for everyone involved. So that's not just the whistleblower, that very much includes witnesses and anyone that's accused within the whistleblowing process as well. Access doesn't depend on going via a line manager. It can also go through a confidential contact or a senior manager, whichever the person feels most comfortable addressing their concerns to. And the INWO ourselves, our team, can provide assistance and advice at any stage in the process to make sure it's progressing smoothly. So that can be advice to the whistleblower or to their union rep if they're giving advice, to the confidential contact. We're also often in touch with boards that have questions about what to do in a particular circumstance too, and we're very happy to give that assistance. In terms of what we can look at if a case came to us after it's been through the local process, which is the standard way of managing things, we can review how the issue itself has been addressed and considered, how it was handled, so how the standards process was progressed within the board, how the whistleblower was treated through the process, or any other member, witness or anyone else that was involved, how they were treated, and the culture of raising concerns in the organisation. So it's a very broad remit. And you don't have to be the original whistleblower to raise a concern with us. If you, for instance, if you feel you're suffering detriment because you were a witness in a whistleblowing case, then you could bring that concern to us as well. And obviously, one of the most important parts of the process, in some ways, is the recording and reporting of issues, to make sure that there's lessons learnt at the end of the process, that recommendations are followed up, and that senior management at all levels are aware of concerns and how they've been responded to. And also that there's good information for all staff about what happens when someone whistleblows. You know, there's nothing like hearing a good news story of what's come out from the end of a process to be a bit more encouraged that process is good and safe to use and worthwhile. And that's really what we're aiming at, is for people to feel like it's safe to raise concerns and that it's worth it because something positive comes out at the end of it. So the reporting and the recording is obviously important, and moving on from that, the reporting of that concern more widely to both senior management and other staff. One of the key questions that I think you'll come up as union reps is about whistleblowing versus HR issues. So identifying what is appropriate to take down a whistleblowing route and what is appropriate for HR. There is often overlap between the two, and the key consideration is who is impacted and what outcomes are being sought. So for whistleblowing, the issue that's being raised must be being raised in the public interest. And generally speaking, the impact will be on several people. Often that will be service users, patients, rather than staff. Whereas HR issues, as you'll know, are more about the individual and the outcomes that individual wants for themselves. So in terms of consideration of the outcomes, individual outcomes often indicate a route an HR process that should be followed, whereas outcomes that impact on several individuals will be whistleblowing. There are where there are overlaps between them, and that can happen. Something that's for instance, if there's something that's detrimental to staff, can often be seen as detrimental for the service they provide too. And bullying and harassment is a classic example of this. But there will be others. If any HR issues impact on many people, then considering what outcome is sought is often a really good way of steering that decision. So a group grievance may be better if the outcome, a better route, if the outcomes that are being sought relate to individuals, the individuals involved. Whereas if it's bullying and harassment concerns that mean that people don't feel safe to raise concerns about patient safety, then that might be something that could be looked at under the whistleblowing process. A grievance will probably achieve more for the individual than a whistleblowing concern would, but the person should be able to choose whether they raise it as whistleblowing or grievance. And the board will then make a definitive decision as to whether they consider it fits within the definition of whistleblowing, if they choose to take it down that route. Once they've got that decision from the board about whether something is or isn't whistleblowing, if they want, then they can bring that concern to the INWO. If the board say you can't raise this as a whistleblowing concern, it doesn't fit the definition, that's a decision by the board, which can then come to us for a review, just like at the end of the process. So thinking a bit then about the benefits of whistleblowing, one of them is that there's a guarantee of confidentiality for everyone that's involved, as much as is possible. If people may guess, but there's certainly the individual's identity should be kept confidential within the process. And there are, it also separates out an issue from an HR process and allows action to be taken separately from HR, so that the person can, make sure that the patient safety issues are being addressed separately from any HR process. It also protects everyone involved from detriment, and that's a really important issue for many people raising concerns. And that includes other witnesses too. They must be protected from, or they mustn't suffer detriment as a result of being a witness in a process, and they must also be provided with support. So in many ways, the whistleblowing process is safer and more protected than any HR process. And it enables access once at the end of the process to us for review. And as I said, if there is any detriment suffered, we can have a look at that and consider whether that has been the result of whistleblowing. So just have a quick look at the routes for accessing those two processes. As you'll see, the HR option, if you're trying to talk someone through their options, that's the kind of considerations you need to make. So for initially, is it HR or is it whistleblowing? And if it is whistleblowing, have they already considered business as usual? Is that more appropriate for them at this point in the process? Would it be easier to resolve things in a more informal way at this stage? Or actually, are they already suffering detriment for having raised it as business as usual? For instance, have they already got to the stage where business as usual isn't appropriate and they should use access it through, raise their concern through the whistleblowing process and access the standards. They can at that point get support with it either through the confidential contact or through line management structures. So that's just to kind of to tease out the different routes, the different options available. As trade union reps, you may need to help your members understand the difference between whistleblowing and HR so that you can explain what their options are and explain those routes to them. And also explain that if there's an issue that or if there's a number of issues, some of which are whistleblowing and some of which are HR, which is often the case we found, then those two can be pursued alongside each other. And it's really important that people feel they can do, you know, pursue both those, because the whistleblowing process shouldn't be stopped or hindered by HR processes. We need to know if there are risks to patients, we need to know about them and act on them. So that's, we've now got to the point at which we're going to have a look at a scenario. So you can, you don't have to have my voice for a bit. Well, I'll introduce you to Stephen and Martin, who are going to take over talking you through this scenario. I hope they can find their mic buttons.
Yep. Thanks, Fran. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
You might want to, yeah, thanks. Good to see you.
Yeah, I'm Martin Mackay, and I'm here along with my colleague Stephen Lindsay, if he wants to show his face.
Hi, hi folks.
We were asked to participate in this in the main because of our role for our respective unions in the Ones for Scotland programme, which we've been doing over the last few years. So we had a background in kind of presenting to groups of unruly trade union representatives. And as just let me get my screen sorted out. As Fran has kind of given you the background there, I hope that's given you some answers to some of the questions that as trade union reps we've all had ourselves about trying to demystify the whistleblowing process for ourselves and for our members. So up on the screen, hopefully now, is the scenario. You can see that with the bullet points there. And for a bit of background, we thought we would use this as something that's been fairly, you know, to the forefront of all our minds over the last couple of years. So the scenario being a nurse is concerned that PPE doesn't meet requirements and leaves them and their patients at risk of infection. They've raised concerns possibly in the past about other areas of clinical practice with their line manager, and as a result of this, they feel the relationship has become very strained. The nurse reports being singled out for criticism, and that there's no trust between them and the line manager. So they approach ourselves, they approach us, their union reps, for advice, telling us about both the PPE issue and their concerns about the line manager and the risk of feeling that they'll be treated less than fairly. So the question here is putting yourself in that position, which I'm sure some of us will have been in over the last couple of years and previously. What is it as a union rep? What are the next steps in this scenario for you? So what we want you to do is take a few minutes to think about that, your own perspectives. Now, we're not here to teach any of us to suck eggs, but this is around the seminar that we're listening to here and whistleblowing. So we'll give you a few minutes to kind of put some answers and formulate some comments around the scenario that you see here and put them in the chat function, and then we can review that and have a bit of a discussion and add some more. So is there anything you want to add to that, Stephen?
No, I think that's fine, Martin. It'll be interesting to see what our colleagues put in the chat box. We seem to have stunned our audience into silence. So
I'm sure they'll be thinking away.
Hopefully, there's a request for somebody to repeat the question, which is: put yourself in the position of the union rep. What are your next steps in this scenario with the nurse? and their concerns about PPE and how they've been treated by the manager.
I should mention that I can't, while I'm sharing my screen, I don't seem to be able to see the chat function. I can see pop-ups of people responding, but I can't go back to them. So I hope you'll be able to review them.
That's fine, Fran. Yep. Obviously, because Martin and I aren't sharing our screens, certainly I can see the chat, so that's fine. Yeah, our colleagues aren't being shy.
Good. Just let me know when you'd like me to move on to the next screen.
I can see it as well, Fran.
Good. Thanks, Rosemary.
Okay, I suspect that's probably, we've had a good number of responses, lots of comments around, escalating appropriately to, more senior management, the health and safety teams, etc. Raising a grievance informally, etc. Do some fact finding, trying to establish what appropriate or sufficient PPE would be. So lots of good things in that. I guess, Fran, if you can take us to the next slide, please. This is the sort of Blue Peter moment. Thank you for the answers that you put in the chat. Here are some of the ideas about the actions the union rep could have taken next from our perspective. So, although Martin used the phrase, we're not wanting to teach Granny how to suck eggs, obviously need to be supportive and to show appreciation for raising the concern and establish if there's any need for immediate action. And I guess advise on whether the whistleblowing procedure would be appropriate. Need to consider whether or not the business as usual processes have been tried and explain that decision as to whether or not to use business as usual or whistleblowing is really up to the individual. It's not a decision for the board or the employer. The board can then determine if they think something falls within the definition of whistleblowing. And if the board says the issue does not meet the definition, this decision can then be taken to the Independent National Whistleblowing Office for review. And of course, the whistleblower must be informed in writing of the decision. I guess if there's an overlap between whistleblowing and HR, and certainly from my reading of the scenario, I'd consider that there probably is, or there's a lack of certainty about which route anyone can phone the Independent National Whistleblowing Officer to talk over the issue. And of course, just because a particular member of a trade union or professional organisation pursues down, say, the whistleblowing route, doesn't prevent them pursuing a parallel issue using business as usual or an HR process. I don't know, I think, is it Rosemary's got a virtual hand up?
Yeah, that is great. I thought it might be helpful for me to comment on a couple of the other questions specifically, because Neil, you'd asked about is there a definition of sufficiency of PPE? I think this is a really good question, because it's not about establishing the fact of whether there is a sufficiency. This is about a member of staff, in their professional opinion or their experience, believing it is insufficient, and it is enough for them to have that view. As to whether it is sufficient is the outcome of an investigation or a business as usual process. So I think in supporting a member of staff, if that's how they feel about it, that's how they feel about it. And one of the things that you might want to encourage them, picking up on the point that was just made, is there are business as usual processes that you can advise people about. So certainly look at the internal health and safety processes first, because it might be a more appropriate route to go down and look at that before invoking the whistleblowing standards, because one of the things that is in there is the importance of business as usual. There is an underlying aim to improve the culture of speaking up, and if you're improving a culture of speaking up, that's done as part of your ordinary job. It shouldn't have to result in a formal whistleblowing concern. The other thing to balance, and this is might be advice that you could give to your members, is that if they have fears or worries about what will happen to them if they speak up, then making a whistleblowing, raising a whistleblowing concern through the process, that is formally invoking it, puts them instantly into that protection from detriment. It also puts them into an area that where there are much more rigorous controls about confidentiality. The boards will have their own requirements for confidentiality. So I think part of the help that you give is this balancing between how your members feel about pursuing business as usual with going formally through whistleblowing, and then it's the sort of pastoral support. Now, somebody had mentioned they hadn't heard of the training. I think we're going to cover resources at some point, so hold that question, because it's a really good one. So I hope that was of help, and I'll shut up now. Whoops, take my hand.
Thanks, Rosemary. I think, Fran, I think we're going back over to you.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all for your contributions. That was good to get so much input there. So what I wanted to do was just to summarise really what you should be doing if a member wants to raise a whistleblowing concern with you in your remit as a trade union rep. So it's important to remember that the member themselves decides what they want to do, whether they want to raise it as whistleblowing or not. But they will be reliant on you for a certain amount of support and also information. And like Rosemary was saying, it's really important to be clear that by raising something as a whistleblowing concern, it gives them significantly more protection. And that's something that that you can spell out to them, particularly in terms of the confidentiality side. But it's important to be supportive of them, because raising concerns is a difficult and stressful thing to do. So it's really being supportive of what they're doing will help them to feel like they're stepping in the right direction with this issue. And again, like we've mentioned before, tease out with them a little bit whether there's a whistleblowing issue, an HR issue, or a bit of both, and which option would be best for them to pursue. Whether if it is whistleblowing, is there a business as usual option they can consider? Check that you're clear on what has happened and what their concerns are and what outcomes they want, because that will help to steer that discussion about what direction to go in. And and explain the process to them. If possible, share confidential contact details, have an awareness of who your confidential contacts in your board are, so that you know who they are, what role they have, and then you can kind of give a bit more information about which one might be the best for that person in that circumstance to approach and to talk through. They might want to talk to their line manager or another senior manager. In terms of confidentiality, it's helpful for the person to think about who will need to know, who will end up knowing their identity. You know, obviously a whistleblowing concern can't be investigated, and someone cannot be given protection if no one knows who that person is. So the organisation will have to know someone in the organisation will need to know who their identity. If someone wants to raise a whistleblowing concern anonymously, they can do, but that is then up to the organisation how they investigate that concern. They're recommended to use the standards as a procedure, but they don't have to, and that person cannot receive protection because no one knows who they are. So the minimum number of people that would be expected to know who their person's identity is probably 2 or 3, possibly 4. So a senior manager, the senior manager coordinating the process, the confidential contact if that's been used, the investigator, and potentially someone to provide them with some support from the organisation. So there's a few people that will need to know that person's identity if it gets as far as an investigation. But that is it, and no one should be. The whistleblower's identity shouldn't be shared with anyone unless they've been told and that will happen and that they've agreed to it. So it's a really the controls around confidentiality, as Rosemary was mentioning, are really quite significant. Union reps do have a vital role to play in supporting the person while they're raising their concern, and it's up to the member what support they get. So it's really important for the member to be leading that decision about what role the union rep plays and how much support they get. They can have someone with them, a union rep with them at meetings if they choose, though they don't have to. It's kind of helpful to note though that if a union rep was at the meeting, they would be there as support rather than in a form of advocacy role. The person would have to speak for themselves. But having someone alongside them in a meeting can be particularly helpful in the early stages of a case where different people within the process may be getting to grips with the detail of it, and that member may, you know, not have mentioned something at an initial conversation that they then don't mention at a later conversation, and the union rep could kind of point out make sure that everything's being raised with each person, because they will end up speaking potentially to the confidential contact, and then the whistleblowing coordinator, and then potentially an investigator, who will all have questions to ask in a similar way. So if a union rep's alongside them, it may help to make sure there's consistency in the information being passed on. But having someone alongside you, you know, if depending on your availability, that might also impact on timescales, and it's a stressful process. So the last thing any of us want to do is to increase those timescales. So there's a bit of a balance there, I think. So I hope that helps to kind of review what the options are when you get a whistleblowing case like that PPE one, what information you need to pass on and what considerations you have. We're going to take a bit of another look at that scenario, progressing to the next stage. So I'll pass back to Martin and Stephen.
Thanks, Fran. Yep, so back to the scenario again. So just a reminder of where we're at. There's a concern about inadequate PPE. There's a perception that patients and staff are at risk. There have been previous issues that the person has experienced raising a concern with their manager. And on the face of it, there is a whistleblowing issue to consider. So let's now think about you and your role as their union rep, and in particular, what do you need to do to support your member and enable them to access the process? So same as before, we'll just take a minute or two for you to jot ideas into the chat box, and then we'll review them. And there will, you are progressing through the presentation, and just as a reminder, you know, there will absolutely be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. I'm sure I'm not the only staff side rep on this call, who's tempted to fill the silence. Okay, thanks, folks. If Martin's there, I think Martin's going to take us through the next slide and review the answers that you've so kindly put in the chat box, folks. Thank you.
Yeah, as if the next slide can come up, and see just as the last part of the scenario, we've jotted down a few of our basic ideas, and you've covered quite a few of them. And obviously the initial role of us as reps is to empathise and support one member. As others have said, it's about getting your ducks in line, getting all your facts, and looking at, I think someone put in the chat, looking at the process and getting it clear for both yourself and your member. It's all about the hearing the concerns and taking them forward. As someone said in the initial chat for the first part of the scenario, how the member wants to take it forward, letting them know that you understand their issues, and then helping them frame their case. So, setting the info out, clear, concise. And I think in terms of the standards, as someone said, reading the standards, making sure, and let's be honest, we always have to manage members' expectations in this a lot, making it clear if the issue is, one that will go down smoothly down the whistleblowing route, or there may be some issues around that, and it may be around how you frame the case for them and assist them with that, and being clear about what the outcomes could be and what the outcomes they wish from it. As someone else said, there could be separate routes for this, and it's about separating out any HR issues. And other folk have talked about contacting HSE. So that's the same. It would be signposting role for yourself as a rep, to make sure you separate them out as needs be, and whether which you want to take first, or which they think they want to manage first. And then again, it's in terms of ongoing support, make sure that they're aware of what to do next in terms of having the contact details around confidential contacts, OHS, all the standard supports, as well as your own continuing input for them. And I think that it's important for us, certainly as Steve and myself, as we were going through this and the lead up to this seminar, it's taken away some of the mystery around whistleblowing for yourselves. And I think the most important element for us was that it's not a closed process to union reps, and that you can be there side by side with your member, so that they won't feel isolated, because there's been a lot of high profile cases over the last few years, and it's the impact on individuals has been one of the elements within that. So I think this process and the seminar today, it's about clarifying for us as union reps that we can be there at every stage for the member, and indeed we can have, as Fran has indicated in some of the earlier slides, you can have access to the whistleblowing officers as a support for yourself, to get clarification, to get advice. I think that's very, very important for us going forward, because when we're clear, then we can be clear for our members. Is there anything else you want to add in on the back of that, Stephen?
No, thanks, Martin. I think you've covered it. And thanks again for your contributions, folks, in the chat box.
I see Rosemary's got you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in there before I start off again?
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce a couple of really good points that were made there and that have been made in the chat as well about the importance of listening and managing expectations, because when Fran and I were involved in a lot of stakeholder focus groups engagement, and one of the things that came through very clearly for me was the fear factor and just the thought that there was somebody there who was not making judgments but was helping, supporting and listening. The other general point I'd make is that being in the room with a whistleblower or potential whistleblower doesn't just relate to particular types of meetings or particular types of scenario. If there is a need to seek advice from us, and Val's probably going to pull a face at this one, we're increasingly used to working online. The standards were launched when we were all in lockdown working from home, so we make use of Teams conference calls, and you can be with a whistleblower who comes to us to seek advice, so you can hear the same things as they hear. You're very welcome to do that. There was one specific question though. Wayne, you'd asked, why does a member have to endure questions from lots of different levels? I think it's probably worth giving a bit of clarity about the 4 different types of role that Fran highlighted. It's not about being questioned at every level. The confidential contact is not the person who would investigate anything. They would be there more to give advice and signposting, but the important thing is that they're confidential. So you may also have reason to talk to your confidential contacts if you want advice about board processes. So that's not about getting lots of questions, it's about broad understanding. Now, there is a whistleblowing coordinator who is responsible for ensuring that the investigation goes to the right place and has oversight of the process. So that again is more about a bit of clarification about what the concern is. The place that is likely to be the most detailed in terms of questions is the person who is investigating. And that is really about, you know, exploring facts and exploring what the issues are that the person is raising and wants to look at. Now, almost separate to that, the support that an organisation is required to provide. This is not a nice to do. The standards are very clear that the organisation must ensure that there is support in place. And to give you an example of some of the cases that we've come across so far, we have specifically asked the board to tell us what their plan is to support the whistleblower. Now, that means that the whistleblower's name would need to be known, but that's not about questioning people about the concern. That is about ensuring that they're properly supported. And again, any conversations with through the support mechanism, if the whistleblower wants you there, the whistleblower, you know, has every right to ask you. So I hope that helps a bit, Wayne. It's not about constantly asking the same questions over again.
Thanks, Rosemary. Right, I'll pick up from that. And these are just some top tips that we have for you, which I hope will be useful, really as a way of trying to get the most out of the whistleblowing process, to make sure that you're kind of a quick and easy things to think about, to make sure that that you can support your members as effectively as possible. If you're helping someone to decide whether something's better for business as usual or whistleblowing, if they have expressed any kind of vulnerability, then that could indicate that they benefit from the whistleblowing process and the protections it has. That can be something like their employment status. You know, if they're part-time and they're feeling vulnerable, or they're in a temporary contract. If there's existing HR issues there, which kind of suggest that there's poor relations already with management, that can suggest that whistleblowing would be a safer route for them. The level of support, as we've said, as Rosemary's just highlighted as well, the level of support that you provide should be led by the member and not by the employer. You can be present at meetings, you can be copied into correspondence, if that's what the member wants while they're going through the process. So speak to them and try and establish what would work for them. And at meetings, you can be there. They'll probably have to answer the questions themselves, but you can always be there to support and you know, remind them of things if that's going to be helpful. Whistleblowing cases often draw in other people too. There are often witnesses involved. People get asked questions and so on. You may be called on to support other people involved in a whistleblowing case. So carefully consider if you get drawn in from two different sides, if you represent more than one person, be really careful of conflicts of interest, because there may be times when it's best to have other reps from other organisations, or from other parts of your organisation that may be able to help you with that, so to make sure that you can keep confidentiality with the member that you have been working with, and that you can provide support to them in the best possible way, because the last thing you want to do is to feel like you're being compromised in the advice or information you're being able to share. Rosemary, do you want to come in? I've seen you got your hand up there.
Yeah, it was just something I was going to suggest. This is based on experience at senior management level of looking at grievance procedures and grievance hearings and things. And whilst whoever is leading this or leading the questions, they may have all the best interests at heart, but not necessarily recognise how the person at the heart of this is feeling at the time. And I think one of the things that you could very helpfully do for whistleblowers, if you are accompanying them, is if you think that they need a break, that I think is a legitimate thing to say. I think it might be appropriate to take a short break or to resume another day, because this should be about what the whistleblower can comfortably, well, it won't be comfortable very often, but reasonably do. So that's one of the things that I think is something where it's maybe a little bit more than just being in the room, but it's not involved in the merits of what's going on. It's in the interests of the whistleblower themselves. Now, I can see that the question has just come up about what if the whistleblower is a manager? Then I think the same applies as to any whistleblowing investigation. This is not about identifying culprits. The standards are about identifying and addressing patient safety issues, concerns about those. And if there are individuals who feel they have suffered detriment, then that is a different sort of consideration. But again, the responsibility and the accountability lies with the board. It doesn't lie specifically with individuals in the board. If something is identified where, you know, this is off the top of my head, you know, we do identify that a particular person has not been well treated by their line manager, if they're a junior manager, a more senior manager, we may well raise that as a recommendation that it is looked at, but ultimately we hold the board to account for these things. And I think it's worth remembering that, because natural justice is inbuilt into the way these standards were written. Probably worth also highlighting that we didn't just sit in a dark room by ourselves and write them. we had a critical friends group drawn from a number of stakeholders, and a lot of the content was what came out of what stakeholders wanted it to cover. The fact that I have the duty to publish them, I really was very open to listening to what everybody thought they should be in terms of fairness. So I'm fairly confident about natural justice. In terms of fair evidencing, I think the phrase I would use is robust evidencing. You know, your evidence has got to be robust. This means that we don't dismiss as evidence witness statements. So it may well be that there are several people interviewed about the same issue. Now, collectively, if they're all giving the same evidence, saying the same things, then that is robust. But it's for the investigation to really look at that. In terms of your later question, Neil, what does this word identify mean? Form a hypothesis, raise a charge. I think that's a bit philosophical for the session at the moment. So I think I'm going to hand back to Fran. I'm not ignoring it. I just think it's a longer, more philosophical discussion.
Thanks, Rosemary. I don't have too much more to go, and I'm keen to get on to questions from yourself. So I'll just wrap this up as quick as I can. One more point that I wanted to what I mentioned before about confidential contacts. They are a really easy access route into the process, particularly for someone who's not particularly confident of management and don't trust their own manager. It is worth getting to know the confidential contacts in your board, finding out who they are, maybe even making contact with them, having a chat to them, introducing yourselves, because the better your communication with them is, the easier it'll be for your members to access the process if and when they need to. It'll ease that process. It'll give them the confidence to contact the confidential contact and to speak to them and use them when the time comes. And the final thing was about recommendations, because I think following up on recommendations and being informed of when they've been completed is a really important thing for many whistleblowers. I think boards haven't necessarily always hit that nail on the head, but it's a point at which, as union reps, you can be really helpful in ensuring there's agreement on what updates the member will get when they can expect recommendations to be fulfilled and what happens if they're not fulfilled. I think that's a point at which having your assistance with them coming back to management or to the process to make sure to follow up on things will be really helpful. So that's really it from us. I just wanted to review very quickly the advice and information, the support that the INWO can give. We have an advice line, which is both phone and email. You can find the details on our website. We're very happy to talk to people, to union reps and or your members. And as Rosemary said, we're happy to do Teams so that you can both be there if that's helpful. We're keen to put people in the right direction. So that's obviously going to be, we want to make sure that this goes well. And a fundamental part of that is making sure that people know the information they need to know. There's on TURAS, there's 2 training modules. One is for people that may want to raise concerns, so that's kind of everyday members of staff, and the other one is currently for those receiving concerns. Now that one may be split out into 2. Hopefully before too long, we're working on that. So if you come to it soon, you'll see that there's 2 programs. You might want to look at the one for those receiving concerns, because that will give you more information about the process as a whole, the detail of it, and what your members can expect from it. If you get there, if you come to the page, the TURAS page, in a few weeks' time, you may find there's 3 programs, and you probably want the middle one, which is for kind of people receiving concerns rather than senior management. You probably don't need to know about the governance area issues around it unless you want to, but that program takes slightly longer. And then there are our bulletins, which come out once a month. They give you a bit of information, top tips about implementing the standards, updates from us, website information and resources. So you can sign up at the bottom of our website for that bulletin if you're interested. And we'd be very keen to engage with you in any way that's going to be most helpful for you. So we've now moved on to questions. I'll just, those are our contact details, so you can have a look at that, any of those. We will now move on to questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen in just a moment so that I can see the chat. And Steph, if you could stop the recording, that would be ideal.